Okay, it's right on the hour. So welcome everyone to this next webcast by courtesy the Conference Board. My name is John Metzler. I am the co-leader together with Rita Shore of the Conference Board's Innovation and Digital Transformation Institute. And it's courtesy of the Institute to offer you this next webcast. This is a special one, as we call it, an urgent and timely issues. I hope you agree that getting to better, more innovation, leveraging the best brains and minds and bodies in the company is a key priority today, more than ever before. So the title of this webcast is Serial Innovators: How to Get More of Them, How to Spot Them, How to Develop Them, and How to Build a Pipeline, because it's never been more important. Before we go into the subject matter and introduce our guests today, let me obviously do the housekeeping as always. This is meant to be as interactive as we can. We have quite some things to share, nice stories, good insights, I think. We're going to make this as interactive as possible, so your questions are very welcome. I'm going to weave them into the conversation. They may not be exactly at the same time, but I'll try to find the right spot. If we leave with questions at the end and they're not answered, then we will go and follow up with that as possible towards after the presentation. You can download the presentation as well if you like what you're going to see. So you find the button, full screen toggle, and you see the button at the top right, if I remember well. And then by all means, if you again like what you're going to see today, don't hesitate and share it with your colleagues. This is like every webcast that we do, at least the complimentary ones. They are available on demand after about 24 hours. So don't hold back, please. And if you have any other feedback, drop it at the end of the session. We're always willing and keen to learn. You can earn credits. Every time I do this, I get more credits, more types of credits. Now we have HRCI, SHRM, and CPE, and then NASBA. There's more acronyms than I used to have at P&G. So click the link in the CEU, another one, requested part in the bottom right corner of the webcast console to sign up for credits. Stay online with the entire webcast. Pay attention. You're going to see pop-ups. 3 of them occur. You missed them, you don't get the credit. And it's only available for you who have tuned in to the live version of the webcast. CPD is another type. I didn't talk that right before. Did I mention CPD? You see, there's another one. We had CPE, now we have CPD. Almost the same thing. Send an email to the address though, stated in the CEU requested part. Click OK, stay online, and only for you. Okay, and more information in that link that you can tap into once you download the presentation. Okay, with that, I would like to go and introduce my guests today, and they are going to go and do quite a bit of talking and share quite some insights. So let me go and take some time to do them justice. Bruce Wojcik founded Breakthrough Innovation Advisors in 2016 to help companies survive and thrive in a volatile, complex, and increasingly ambiguous world. As a leading authority on breakthrough innovation, he brings a unique and powerful combination of deep and broad expertise, as well as a rich network of other experts to guide his clients in harnessing its benefits. Privileged to be part of that network by now. Bruce is a co-author of Serial Innovators: How Individuals Create and Deliver Breakthrough Innovations in Mature Firms, and he's going to go and refer and talk from that book, obviously, in the session today. He serves on several boards and periodically consults on the topic of innovation for Procter & Gamble, and regularly presents to, leads workshops for, and advises various other companies. And this is how I met Bruce the first time many years ago. Previously, Bruce served as an associate dean and adjunct professor in the top-ranked College of Engineering at the University of Illinois, and he was a director before that of advanced technology for Motorola. And we're very pleased to have Bruce come back for this webcast. Nancy Dawes is a serial innovator with roots in the CPG industry. Through her holistic innovation program, she led major breakthrough changes in the food, Pringles, and beauty, Olay industries, taking these multi-billion dollar equities to new heights with significant financial gains for, in this case, P&G as a result. Nancy embodies the concept of a serial innovator. She leads consumer discovery research that uncovers new insights and sensory cues that she integrates with technologies to guide a holistic product design program. This enables business teams then to reframe industry categories founded on new products and new market claims that excite consumers, and also enable retailers to drive new markets at scale. As a P&G Research Fellow, she made it to the very elite Victor Mill Society. Today, Nancy leads her own consultancy firm and is a sought-after speaker and trainer on topics ranging from serial innovation to inclusive leadership. And we're thrilled to have her tell her stories and share her insights. So this combination should be, as we saw last time, pretty powerful. Now, I do want to say one more thing, which is this is not your average random webcast, but this is actually part of a series. We've developed this into a program. And because we feel so strongly about this, and the scope of the topic is so large, we broke it up in 3 parts. The first part happened in Jan 14, happened in Jan 2020, and I'm not sure if anybody of you was there. If not, you can watch it on demand. If you have any questions about where to find it, drop us a note. And this focused on who they are and where they are. This is an introduction to the people view of innovation. We really went deeply into identifying those serial innovators. Today, we're going to go to the next step, which is, okay, we have identified those serial innovators. Now, how to spot them, develop them, and then build that pipeline, make it systemic. And the next step is, once you have managed that, once you've done that, you need to learn to manage them. And so our next session, which we're timing to be defined later in 2020, is going to illustrate how to manage and unleash them for impact. So please be watchful if you're interested. More to come. So that's the program, and we are smack in the middle of it. And so today we're going to talk about spotting them, developing them, and build a pipeline. It's my pleasure to hand over to Bruce again to take us away.
Great, thanks, John. Nancy and I have enjoyed working with you to develop the last one and this one, and we look forward to the next one as well. As John mentioned, this is one webinar in a series of 3, and so today I'm going to begin by recapping that January 2020 webcast. I'll spend some time talking a bit with you about this people versus process view of innovation to help you understand who these serial innovators are. And then the focus today are really on 3 things. There'll be a discussion on how to identify serial innovators, especially early in their career. And to develop that, Nancy will tell stories about 2 of her very broad and deep experiences at P&G, one in the area of cookies and the other in the area of crisps, which I've always enjoyed hearing these stories as well as her later stories. So I believe you will too. I'll return to talk a bit about how you can go about managing young innovators in their first up to about 15 years in a company to help them become potentially become serial innovators. And then finally, we'll talk a bit more, as John said, about the systemic aspects of how to build a pipeline of serial innovators. So again, right now, what I'm going to do is I'll give you a recap of the last webinar. As John mentioned, please go back and look at it and view it on demand if you have interest to go deeper than this. The idea of presenting this is to give you this context so that you can see Nancy's stories in this broader context. So, again, going back to recap that, with a couple of colleagues, with Abby Griffin and Ray Price, when we were all at the University of Illinois, we spent a little over a decade studying a group of people that are very rare in organizations, but extremely important. And we've called them serial innovators. These are people who, like Nancy, repeatedly identify and develop and bring to market, they commercialize breakthrough innovative ideas. They have huge financial impact on their companies. They have impact on billion-dollar brands. Once Ray Price and I estimated that they have about a 100x financial impact on their companies relative to their colleagues, to the and I hate to say average, but the other colleagues in an organization. So these are a very small number of very high contributing people in an organization. And what I've enjoyed viewing them as is these are the most important people in a company you've never heard of. We won't go into it today, but we're not talking about the Steve Jobs or the Jeff Bezoses of the world. We're talking about people who are embedded in the company but have these huge differences. Today you'll hear From Nancy, that's her picture on the lower left. She'll be talking about a couple of examples earlier in her career. If you're interested in reading stories of others in our book, not to make a shameless pitch for it, but we have a very nice, I believe, story profile of Tom Osborne, who redefined the feminine hygiene product industry when he was at P&G. So these will give you an idea of the kinds of things these people do and what makes them so powerful and unique. As we were discussing this, as John and Nancy and I were discussing, preparing for this webinar, we've talked a bit over time about VUCA, but as John pointed out correctly, we're right now in the middle of a VUCA world on steroids. So even before COVID, a lot of things in industry were volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But now it seems as if almost every week there's something different that we're dealing with. And the idea here is to say, people like Nancy, serial innovators and companies are going to be even more important than ever. Because while everyone else is getting bullwhipped around, you want people who are going to be looking at how do we define and redefine the nature of competition in an industry. And so, again, we believe this is timely for many reasons, as John pointed out at the outset. In that first webcast, we talked a bit about the research that I'll be really discussing in my part of this presentation. In that research, Abby and Ray and I captured very specific stories from a range of large, mature North American companies, like those shown here with their logos. Stories of people who innovated in this major way. We conducted a large number of interviews. We did a large sample survey, broad industry coverage, and arising from the study, we published a book in 2012, Serial Innovators, through Stanford Press, and then it's been subsequently translated with the help of some great colleagues in Japan. It's the pink copy there on the right. And so, again, if you have interest in digging into this deeper, this is one way to do so. One of the things that I like to talk about when I think of innovation is I look at the S-curve of revenue for a product or a company. And it's shown here schematically on this chart. Again, I don't need to go through this in detail, but what happens when you hit maturity, or even really you should be dealing with this before you hit maturity, you hit a fork in the road. You get to a point where you're going to have to make some decisions. So you're either going to try to extend maturity, and that's really one of the three options on the right, going horizontal. And you do that often by incremental innovation, by making small, important adjustments, but things to perhaps lower cost, maybe add a few features, and allow you to maintain competition over time. A number of companies will decide at this point to exit or decline, and that's a very valid option. But what we're focusing on today are the companies that decide we want to renew. We want to really stay in this area and in many respects redefine it. And so breakthrough innovation really renews and redefines the basis of competition. And you're going to see this in Nancy's stories. And again, I want to point out, these are early career stories you're hearing about. Go back to the January webinar and you'll hear kind of at the mature career level, the major changes she identified and implemented in again, another field entirely, again, within consumer products. So, and this will be kind of one whirlwind slide, if you will, but every serial innovator that we interviewed followed a pattern. And there's a set of patterns that I illustrate with this slide, 4 different sets of patterns. Again, in the upper left is that product or business life cycle. Here, again, these are people that impact the survival of a firm because they're the ones who renew the business. On the upper right is a list of 4 areas that serial innovators engage with. They engage with problems, projects, organizational politics, and people. And again, we don't have time to go into great detail, but in a nutshell, when they engage with a problem, and you're going to see this in Nancy's stories, beautifully illustrated, they're deeply curious. They're broadly curious. They look at a problem in a very holistic way, in a nonlinear way. They see how one small thing over here can make a huge difference over here or even over here. And so they're looking at problems in ways that are really not the norm for a large number of employees. When they engage with projects, they persist, they persevere. They're the kind of people that don't just have ideas, but they work to make these ideas happen. You're going to, again, later in Nancy's story, she's going to talk about when you identify these people, one of the ways to identify them is they're people that follow through on ideas that they have. Politics, and by this I mean organizational politics, the people that have been identified as serial innovators, and that means they're successful at bringing something truly to market, know how to navigate the organization. And then finally, how they engage with people. They really build trust and respect. We'll come back to this much later in this webinar. But again, building trust and respect, getting other people involved, valuing other people is hugely important. Lower left, again, we'll see this in Nancy's talk. They're holistic thinkers. They see a large range of dots and they find patterns that others don't see. Lower right, instead of a strictly linear process that you might find in a stage gate, and again, I'm not intending to disparage stage gate, but this is a highly nonlinear and iterative process that you'll observe when these serial innovators work. So in a nutshell, these are people who impact companies, they allow them to survive, they have a complete set of characteristics, not partially, a partial set. They think very holistically and non-linearly. And these characteristics together are what you see, and these are the patterns that emerge when these people operate. There's another way to frame this, and that's identifiable characteristics. I won't probably spend as much time on this slide, but basically, these are people that see connections at a distance. They're systems thinkers. Above average creativity, I want to point out that while they're creative, they're innovative. The distinction being these are people that truly bring products to market successfully. They have this innate curiosity. Nancy will later talk about some of the interests that you see in these people. There's one story that we had in our research that I just love to hear. It was someone who had a hobby, and it was they were interested in growing flowers. And so instead of buying just a couple of flowers, they went out and they bought a nursery because they wanted to deeply, curiously go out and understand what did it mean to grow flowers. Their intuition is informed by this curiosity. They're able to connect dots in ways that others can't. And finally, and I'd say almost most important, is this intrinsic motivation. These are people who are there who truly want to solve customer or consumer needs, and they're also there to create value. They're motivated to help both the customer or consumer. They're there to help the company. They're there to help their coworkers. They're there to, if you will, serve management. They're intrinsically motivated to simultaneously do all these things. And if you find someone that doesn't have these identifiable characteristics, but especially the last one, you'll find someone that we'll begin to talk about, and Nancy will refer to as wild ducks. And they might be interested in, oh, isn't this a neat idea? Or might this be fun to play, if you will, or work on? They might not even use those words exactly. But at the end of the day, the ones who solve customer and consumer needs and create value for the company that they're in are truly the serial innovators. It's this complete set. So I know that's a bit of a whirlwind, but we felt it was important to give you that context. And now I'll hand it over to Nancy, and she'll share some stories about how to identify serial innovators, again, especially early in their career.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. In last January's webcast, I talked about the development of Olay Total Effects, the innovation that created the masstige market and turned Olay's declining business into a billion-dollar brand. Development of Olay Total Effects was followed by multiple Olay sub-brands like Olay Regenerist and Definity, which contributed to the beauty division being 44% of P&G's sales growth between 2000 and 2009. For this webcast, however, I'm going to move back to the early days of my career and share some stories and examples of early work that could identify me as a future serial innovator who could move on to reinvent the Olay business. I love the quote from one of the managers interviewed in Bruce's book. Before you really get to know them, it is difficult to separate out the potential serial innovators from the wild ducks. Thus, he found that he had to support all of the wild ducks in his organization as if they were serial innovators until he could discern who had the capability to create breakthrough innovations and who was just going to keep throwing out new ideas that either had no market potential or could not be developed. I'm going to share lessons based on my personal development and years mentoring future serial innovators at P&G. Lessons to help you spot potential serial innovators and separate them from the wild ducks early in their career. There are 5 differentiators that I'll discuss: rising above groupthink to successfully solve a problem, being spatial, not spacey, productively challenge the status quo, having deep and intimate curiosity, and I'll wrap up with the analogy of the spider in its web. So, one of the early ways to identify a potential serial innovator is their approach to solving problems and creating knowledge. When you hire someone into your company, it takes a few years for them to develop the basic skills, which is often done in early problem-solving assignment. Look for someone who solved a problem differently than most people expected and delivered better than expected results. However, it's important to pay attention to how the young innovator solved the problem. Often the solution seems obvious once it is done, so a mentor or manager needs to take the time to understand the innovator's thinking process. Let me illustrate this with a Duncan Hines cookie story. In the 1980s, Duncan Hines launched packaged, shelf-stable chocolate chip cookies that tasted homemade because they maintained a fresh-baked, crispy, chewy texture virtually forever. Fresh homemade chocolate chip cookies are crispy on the outside and chewy on the inside, but as homemade cookies age, they stale and become uniformly hard due to the sucrose crystallization. P&G had developed a patented formula that created forever crispy, chewy texture. A non-crystallizing fructose dough loaded with chocolate chips was wrapped with a thin layer of sucrose dough, and voila, you have shelf-stable, crispy on the outside, chewy on the inside cookies. P&G launched these like homemade chocolate chip cookies to compete with hard and crispy Chips Ahoy. The cookie was preferred 2-to-1 versus Chips Ahoy. However, consumers told us that although the texture was delightful, Duncan Hines cookies had less chocolate flavor than Chips Ahoy. This was surprising because the cookies actually had slightly more chocolate than Chips Ahoy. But it created a challenging assignment for a young innovator: fix the deficit in chocolate flavor. Clearly, this was an issue with the chocolate. I was given resources to study the amount of chocolate, the type of chocolate, the composition of the chocolate, fat melt temperature, chip size. It was about the chocolate. Well, as it turned out, the non-obvious solution was to make the chips show on the cookie surface. Because the chips were contained in the inner dough, they were hidden. If you look at that advertising copy, which is the left-hand picture, you'll see that we showed a cross section, but if you look at the surface, you'll notice there are not chips poking through. I remember having women bake homemade chocolate chip cookies and seeing them displayed on a lab countertop. And I noticed that you saw lots of chips on the surface. When my husband or kids chose a chocolate chip cookie out of a plate, they chose the one that had lots of chips showing. And then finally, as Dr. Seuss taught me in Green Eggs and Ham, how a food looks impacts its taste. So the solution was to have chips show versus a more costly solution of increasing the chocolate content. Pretty obvious once identified. So how might a manager discover this ability? Obviously, the first is to identify those young innovators who successfully deliver their project objectives. But it takes more. In my case, my manager spent time with me talking about how I came up with the solution and asking me questions like, what caused me to think about chip show? Importantly, in giving me time to share my story, he would have observed, evidence of exploring the problem from multiple perspectives. I had learned about manufacturing to teach me why the chips were inside the cookie. How might we change the process to make the chips show? I observed people choosing cookies from a plate of cookies. I ran blind versus sighted taste tests to learn about chocolate flavor perception. I studied formulation interaction between chips and dough. Secondly, he would have observed a non-obvious solution that gave a better result. In this case, making chips show was a more cost-effective solution than adding more chocolate. And third, he would have observed some tenacity and the courage to explore something different than management expected. I also tell the story here that my immediate boss had spent several weeks in Europe working with chocolate flavor houses to learn how to change chocolate flavor display. So my solution could have made my boss's expense look fruitless, and that took courage. So the second differentiating characteristic I want to talk about, I call spatial versus spacey. Let me explain.
Nancy?
Yes?
Just a sec. First of all, thank you for that first point. I think it's awesome. It also reminds me of this quote, which I often use, which is fall in love with the problem, not the solution. People jump to solutions way too quickly, right?
Yep.
So your boss already hovering around Europe for better chocolate, which is a great story indeed. But I just wanted to make that point to just make sure we have a lot of people that join late, and they may miss my point around we want to make this interactive. So at any time, just throw your question into the chat box, and I'll see when to weave it into the conversation. For now, no questions, so please go to number 2.
Okay, thank you. So a key attribute observed in Bruce's research is that serial innovators exhibit synthetic thinking. They connect the dots, they holistically integrate disparate perspectives, they keep multiple balls spinning. However, early in a career, this approach can be challenging to the analytic linear thinkers who often surround and manage them. To a linear thinker, synthetic thinking seems like the innovator is talking in circles or moving all over the place. The challenge for managers and mentors, as labeled by one of my mentees, is separating people who are spatial, not spacey. I'm going to share another example from early in my career, the assignment after cookies. Now, you may find it a little complicated and confusing as I share the example, but the idea is to give you a sense of how a young holistic thinker created a solution that was larger than the original problem. So the assignment was to improve Pringles' taste to make it taste more like a conventional potato chip. I'm going to actually share the beginning and the end of the story. In the beginning, business was stagnant, and the belief was that taste was the issue. When Pringles was developed in the late 70s, it was a reinvention of traditional chips, eliminating the greasy taste, greasy finger feel, and broken crumbled chips. However, the scaled-up version never tasted like the pilot plant version, and P&G managers thought the issue was that it didn't taste like conventional chips. Now, although Pringles had less greasy feel, it actually had substantially higher fat content than conventional chips. This was because Pringles were made on a modified paper line where a dough made of dried potato flakes and water was rolled, cut, and fried. Water was necessary to create an elastic dough that would not tear in high-speed rolling. However, water content in the dough controlled fat content in the final chip because there was basically a one-on-one exchange during frying. Now, another reality was that Pringles fell under a standard of identity which was specifically written for it as a result of competitive chip manufacturers banding together when they learned a large company was going into the potato chip business. Specifically, a potato chip made from dried potato flakes needed the words "made from dried potatoes" on the front label. Not very appealing. Now, in the end, when I completed this assignment, the Pringles business tripled. Pringles was the only top 10 snack food brand in the US not owned by Frito-Lay. I had proved that Pringles tasted better than Lay's, with lower fat content, and we saved the Pringles Light business. And we created a new crisp category that enabled a new marketing campaign that celebrated Pringles' uniqueness and poised it for global expansion. So how did this happen? This is where it gets messy. First of all, I learned that even though P&G thought the issue was Pringles' taste, it turned out that Pringles lovers loved its unique taste and its dependable sameness and less greasy feel. Kids loved Pringles' taste and easy to hold and stack shape. But the very things that lovers loved was what haters hated. Pringles' uniformity and consistency. So even if Pringles' taste was identical to conventional chips, it was unlikely that the haters would choose it, and we might lose our current buyers. Okay, another issue was the upcoming FDA Food and Nutritional Labeling Act. There was increased awareness of the negative role of fat in the American diet, and light food labeling was not regulated, much like natural today. The act would require light to be 1/3 the fat level of regular, which put about 30% of the Pringles business at risk. Thus, the major project focus was to protect the business by complying with the new FDA regulations, which meant we needed to learn how to lower fat content. We discovered the inclusion of maltodextrin enabled the right dough elasticity with lower water content. This meant the plant could run at high line speeds without tearing the dough sheet, but the fried chips absorbed less fat. Fat reduction allowed Pringles Light to deliver the third less fat and be in compliance with the Labeling Act. But the inclusion of maltodextrin had other advantages. One, recall the FDA standard of identity was for a product containing dried potatoes, oil, and salt, basically the composition of a traditional chip. Maltodextrin is corn-based, so technically it was outside the standard of identity, and thus you could take off the appealing or unappealing "no more made from dried potatoes" from the front label. And finally, the inclusion of maltodextrin subtly changed the flavor. This enabled me to convince management that we improved the taste, but reframe Pringles versus competition rather than versus ourselves. So, in the end, a simple assignment to improve the taste of Pringles ended up creating a new snack category and totally repositioning a brand, a result of connecting multiple dots. But how do you separate those who are spatial from those wild ducks who are just spacey? You can imagine I may have been viewed as chaotic by my manager when he's thinking about lowering the fat content, and I'm proposing we can take the words "made from dried potatoes" off the front label. So let me share 3 thoughts about how to help you identify the potential cereal innovators. First, help them make the implicit explicit by creating a visual model or mind map. My experience with potential cereal innovators is they often have connected multiple ideas, but they skip around when trying to explain how they are connected, because it is obvious to them, and therefore they think it's obvious to everyone. One of the tools I use is to ask the potential cereal innovator to draw a visual model, capture each idea or insight, and draw lines to make the connections explicit. So in my Pringles example, this model enables me to make explicit the connections between the technology requirements, consumer beliefs, and market needs to illustrate how adding maltodextrin enables us to remove "made from dried potatoes" from the label. Now, related to this observation is that potential cereal innovators often think in metaphors. For Pringles, I talk about Pringles manufacturing being similar to paper manufacturing, or I could describe fat inside a Pringles chip is like water inside a sponge. But creating a visual model, whether it's a mind map or a metaphor, helps the innovator explain their thinking and helps the mentor or manager understand the connections. Now, linked to this, another important differentiator in separating those who are spatial versus spacey is their ability to create knowledge by defining the critical experiment. So let's assume a young innovator came into my office suggesting the issue with Pringles non-buyers. It's not its taste, but its uniformity. My question to them is, how would you prove it? For instance, they may suggest forming and frying real slices of potato on a Pringle-shaped mold, create uniformly shaped chips that taste like regular potato chips, and test to see if non-buyers like them, and determine if improving the taste would solve the issue. Linked to this, the third attribute that distinguishes the potential serial innovator is tenacity. So, if the person has a great idea and can articulate the critical experiment, but doesn't follow through, that's an indication they won't develop into a full-fledged serial innovator. Often the excuses sound reasonable. I didn't do it because my boss didn't like it. Or, we will never make Pringles out of real sliced potatoes. Why would you waste your time testing something that is not feasible? I take this lack of follow-through as a sign that the person will not have the persistence required to make breakthroughs. But for those who persist in the face of challenge, I made Pringle-shaped potato chips at home and gave them to my neighbor who hates Pringles, and they still would not eat them. I take that as a sign of a potential serial innovator. Now, a note here is often the ability to differentiate the spatial from spacey requires a long-term engagement with the individual. Often as I mentor young innovators, if they have identified a critical experiment, it may take a while to get the resources or skunk works to run the experiment. So I might not hear about it for a while. Or they may come back with, I ran the experiment, but it didn't work, and I'm working on this new idea. Either of those give me an indication they have the tenacity to succeed to become a serial innovator.
Nancy?
Yep.
Before you move on, a few things. One is, this is great. I mean, I love the point, the spatial versus spacey. I love your point on critical experiment in particular. Identify that one thing to do so you understand, it shows you understand the full problem. We need to be a bit careful because you took quite a while to explain that spatial versus spacey, which of course it takes a bit of time to explain the complexity. But we're already in 37, so we only have 23 minutes left. So be aware as you move forward. Tish, your question is going to be addressed. Rita, we're going to address your question later on when we have the plenary conversation that fits better there. Please go on for number 3.
Okay.
With a bit more acceleration.
Okay. And that's fair. The spatial one is really an important one, so I took a little bit more time there because that tends to be a difficult one. Productively challenging the status quo is another differentiator. Serial innovators often question why something is done. They reveal and challenge unarticulated assumptions. The skill in separating the potential serial innovator from the wild ducks is the ability to do it productively. Let me give you just a couple quick examples. The project objective for Pringles assumed taste was the issue. As I told you, I learned taste was not the issue. But I also had internal managers whom I needed to convince that taste was not the issue. So I needed to step back and understand why they thought it was an issue so I could create a win-win. When Pringles was launched in the 70s, the Skella Pringles didn't taste the same as the ones made in the pilot plant. However, due to huge competitive response and the FDA labeling requirements, the pre-market volume forecast for Pringles was higher than actual. Meanwhile, expensive manufacturing lines had been built, and P&G ended up taking a huge write-off for those. My current upper managers were the frontline managers during this traumatic experience, and taste was the issue that was imprinted on them. So I knew I needed to deliver data to make them confident that poor taste was not the issue. But rather than run the standard internal methodology of new and improved versus old among female shoppers, I challenged the protocol to test versus Lay's among a more relevant group of potato chip eaters, men, women, and kids. This enabled me to include kids in the test, as I knew kids disproportionately loved Pringles. And in fact, among this subset, Pringles were preferred about 80-20. And this win versus Lay's created the confidence to create the breakthrough advertising and celebrate Pringles' uniqueness. The second challenge was with Pringles of standard of identity. Nobody thought Pringles could not be within the standard of identity that was written specifically for it. I recall during my first meeting with our internal regulatory person, he was a little surprised at first and a little perplexed, but then he understood the logic. If we have corn, we're not the same composition as potato chips. And he became an ally and helped convince brand management to make the changes. Again, how do you find evidence of this? Because Bruce's research showed serial innovators not only challenge the status quo, but they develop skills building teams and influencing others. One is they are people who take time to understand why others believe the status quo. They're willing to look for win-win solutions, such as my figuring out how to convince managers taste was better than Lay's. And they show evidence of enrolling others, which was my relationship and developing an ally in regulatory. Okay, moving on. The fourth is deep and intimate curiosity. Okay, and deep and intimate curiosity is defined as having multiple interests and exploring these interests deeply. Bruce identified serial innovators required preparation for technical skills, deep knowledge in multiple domains, business understanding, customer understanding, process understanding, and they discovered most of the serial innovators were intrinsically motivated and learned through self-study. So how might you identify deep, broad, and intimate curiosity? I suggest looking at some of their hobbies. For instance, look for somebody who plays not only one instrument, but went on to learn other instruments that were related, or perhaps makes instruments versus just playing them. For reading, somebody who is intentional about what they read, or moves from reading a book on overt leadership to choosing to read historical fiction to understand leadership from a different perspective. And do they learn firsthand? Instead of just listening to cooking shows, do they actually experiment with recipes? One serial innovator working on shampoo started the assignment by buying up all the competitive shampoo products and spending a morning washing his own hair. But why is curiosity so important? Bruce and all discovered that often the serial innovators were M-shaped innovators. So let me explain by contrasting these M-shaped innovators with I, T, and pi-shaped innovators. The I-shaped technologist is somebody deep in one domain, often referred to as an inventor. In the Pringles story, this would be the PhD food scientist, likely named on the maltodextrin patent, who quantified the interaction of different food grade additives on dough elasticity and water content. The T-shaped technologist is someone deep in one domain who also has breadth, often in industry, customer, or business knowledge. So in the Pringles example, the T-shaped technologist could have the insight linking the inclusion of maltodextrin with the ability to move outside the FDA standard of identity and take off the words made from dried potatoes. The pie-shaped technologists deliver deep technical knowledge across multiple technical areas while continuing to develop breadth. So in our Pringles example, they might not only study the interaction between ingredients and dough elasticity, but expand to study the interaction between dough rheology and manufacturing milling speeds. Few innovators move on to become M-shaped, where they develop the breadth of knowledge across domains and in multiple technical domains. Now, the final analogy I want to share with you to help identify potential serial innovators is to think about a spider and its web.
In 2 minutes, please.
Yep. In the end, a spider needs to be productive and capture food, which is similar to the success measure for the serial innovator. Do they create an innovation that makes a difference for their consumers and the company? The serial innovator is intimate to the problem, just as a spider is intimate to its web. The spider can sit anywhere in its web, and anything that touches it sends a signal. The spider feels the vibration and needs to discern, is it the wind, or is it the fly, or is it a dangerous bee? The spider uses all its knowledge and mastery to discern what it has captured, and if it is a fly, it moves on to immobilize and eat it. Similarly, the potential serial innovator gets exposure to lots of ideas, but they need to be able to discern the fly from the wind. Going after every idea without ever capturing food is a sign of a wild duck. The spider needs to be well versed in multiple technical domains, web building, food immobilization, and just as the serial innovator needs to be N-shaped and versed in multiple technical domains. But the key is whether the potential serial innovator can go out and make something happen, new knowledge, new insight, and create an innovation that makes a difference. And with that, I'll turn it back to Bruce.
Bruce? Thank you, Nancy. Bruce, as you go into it, please make sure you answer Tish's question, which is, are serial innovators primarily discovered at the early career stage? Or is she coincidentally illustrating case studies that occurred during the younger years? Nancy. And you, I will,
John,
make sure you understand that that question came in, please.
Yeah, thanks for calling that out. It's a good question, and I'll address it actually in this next set of slides, or I'll express it explicitly as part of this. The next thing we're going to discuss, after having identified people who are potentially serial innovators, I'm going to talk a bit about how to manage them to hopefully become serial innovators. And what we found in our work was that typically a serial innovator will fully emerge by the time they have 15 years experience, usually in one company, one industry, well, now if I say industry, in Nancy's case, consumer products, if you will. Now, Tish's question is really good because it was asked, are they primarily discovered at this early career stage, or is Nancy's set of stories coincidentally? The point is they are identified when they have delivered a successful breakthrough innovation, and they've proven that they're not, if you will, a one-hit wonder. They can do it again. And so what we did in defining this presentation is we specifically took these two wins of Nancy's and shared them to show how, gee, Nancy did this amazing thing with the cookies, and oh my gosh, she went through and she did it again with a different product in a different field. And again, if you go back to the January webinar, you'll see she did it yet again with Olay. And so the idea is they're clearly identified when they've delivered like this. The question then is, what do you do as they're going through this, if you will, 0 to 10 or 15 year time period? And what we saw is that there's really two broad phases of development. And the first is kind of this early development stage, and Nancy's stories are kind of in the mid to late part of that, as well as into the early part of what we would call the maturation phase. And so just to discuss these briefly, the first 5 years, anybody in any company, the best thing they can be doing is really establishing skills, establishing work patterns, and effectively gaining credibility. Because trust and respect in any company that I've worked with, trust and respect really are together the coin of the realm. They're the things that allow you to be heard, to be listened to by others. And so even if you have an idea that may go counter to what the industry normally would accept, and again, Nancy's examples are wonderful cases of that. She had established this basis of trust and respect for people to listen to her, and it's just really incredibly important for that to be worked on, both by the manager developing the potential innovator, and again, we have both wild ducks and truly potential innovators in this mix.
Bruce?
Job assignments are important. You saw here in Nancy's case, two very different job assignments. External. Yes,
sorry,
John.
you need to wrap it up in 5 minutes because we got two excellent questions which I want to address before the hour. So
Okay,
please
very
go
good.
punch.
I will step back and just touch on a few highlights. These are people that get this external exposure. You heard Nancy talking about Chips Ahoy. These are people that are developing organizational skills. You're not looking to develop them into managers at this point, just people who can work with managers. And you want to implement this broadly because you still don't know who is a wild duck and who is going to emerge truly as a serial innovator. Some people are going to say, hey, it's obvious. These are things that you should be out there teaching and people are learning in my company. My question, and actually all three of us, we discussed this just last week, is it really all this obvious? Are your employees actually developing these skills broadly? But again, you're beginning to see patterns like this emerge after 5 years. What you find in the maturation phase, and this is where I would say they're beginning to prepare to fly, you tailor your focus and you spend more time on those that you identify as emerging. This is where you begin to separate them, give them more customized development. There will still be some false positives and negatives. But again, you're looking to complete their breadth and depth. You're challenging them to work on new opportunities for growth. You don't want to necessarily facilitate everything for them. You want them to begin to emerge as self-directed because they're going to be the next generation of leaders in the company. And again, we see this just wonderfully in Nancy's story. And then finally, moving from managing this cohort into a small number that might be innovators, how do you build a pipeline? This is a chart from our book. I won't go into it in detail other than to say that the vertical axes, each one is a different time period, if you will. Those who on the left are relatively new, those on the right that are proven innovators. These are just some scenarios you might find. You might find a company that has some proven and new innovators, but nobody coming up behind them. That's a problem. You might find a company that has somebody that did something once, but you're not really sure if that was lucky or if it was real. And so what you want to do ideally is to develop a pipeline of people across these different levels of development. And really what you do then, and John had mentioned this earlier, is moving more towards a systemic approach to develop them. You want to be sure that people value these contributions and move more to the organizational level. And the key here in this last set of maybe 2 or 3 slides is if you have proven serial innovators, use them to help build your pipeline. That is important. Nancy alluded to this before. She was helped and she helped others. It's an important factor. These are just some best practices. I'm going to suggest that people might want to come back to these later to watch this. But in a nutshell, I'm just going to pull one out of here. The assignment. Nancy had mentioned, and I'm going to just highlight briefly, that when she started working on one of the products, it had a 2-to-1 preference. The Duncan Hines was already preferred 2-to-1. That's an incredibly difficult assignment. How do you approve on something that's doing so well? But if you find someone who you think might have potential, give them a tough problem. And that difficult problem may not be something that is doing poorly. It may be something that's doing quite well, and they may move forward to rethink things. And so, again, I think for the benefit of time, and to answer some of the questions, I'll end with this here. Again, we've covered a lot of material today, and we look forward to coming back to you with the 3rd webinar. And our question to you is, okay, you've seen this, what will you do about it? What do you think about this, and what do you plan to do? So, John, returning back to you.
Thank you for your
Thanks
for your agility and flexibility here. I know you were cut short a bit at the end because Nancy took a bit longer, but I think it was worth it. And we'll recap some of the points you wanted to make at the start of our 3rd edition. I did want to get to 2 questions, as I said. One is Fika's asking, thank you, Nancy, do you think people become serial innovators without being one already, or are they born serial innovators? The big question around, are people leaders, or are they born, do they become leaders, or are they leaders? What's your perspective on this, or Bruce, or both? 2 minutes.
Yeah, my perspective is some people have more of the innate characteristics to become a serial innovator, and everybody has the ability to become a better innovator I think, by applying some of these tools. One of the things I did early on is I remember I had been to a class that talked about innovation, and it shared the idea of reading broadly and having lots of hobbies, and I became very intentional about that.
That's a fantastic answer.
Yeah,
Sorry, go on, Bruce.
Great points.
Yeah, me too. That was a great answer. And then Rita Shore is asking, any advice for emerging serial innovators if their management over controls and doesn't seem to know how to mentor them, frankly, how to manage them. Now we're going to talk more of that in our third session, but already maybe a teaser here.
I'd say you have to develop discernment, but Nancy, if someone jumps too quickly all the time, it's a problem. If somebody waits too long, it's a problem. You need to develop how much you can work within the system. But Nancy, you may have other.
Well, and I think this was about a person is a serial innovator and has a manager who's linear. My advice would be try to find a mentor, right, who is a divergent thinker, and access them to both learn how you can better work with that manager, and then often the mentor is somebody who can work around and can also help coach that manager. I know in my career there were several instances where my mentor was very useful in explaining to others how this kind of wild duck who was trying to connect maltodextrin and made from dried potatoes with take the words off the label.
Excellent. And not really a wild duck.
Right.
Truly a serial.
Well, and that's why I said there were some conversations early on. It's hard to tell a wild duck from a serial innovator. And so part of it is having the engagement with the person to understand how they think, and also to support them in helping them, I would say, communicate analytically. And I would certainly say both of John and Bruce in helping me get my stories more linear for this presentation is one of those advantages that surrounding yourself with different people helps with.
Yeah, I can testify to that as well. We worked on this together in our P&G years, right? And we found it to be an incredible challenge to have typical managers work with serial innovators or potential serial innovators, and it needs to come from both sides. But once that partnership works, the potential is absolutely huge. But to all of you, go and invest in this in your company, in your organization, because the power is untapped. It's those people that the most important people you don't know where they are. So with that, and Rachel, I guess you got your question answered as well through Nancy, right? Because it's looking at the other side of the point that Rita started. Thank you for your engagement, for your questions. We are 2 minutes. We have 2 minutes left. A final comment from from each of you. 30 seconds. What do you want to leave the audience with?
Mine is tune in for the next one, because this whole topic of how to manage, we are going to spend a whole 45 minutes on with people that have learned how to do it.
Bruce?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think the thing I'll leave with everybody who hears this is, again, what are you going to do with this information?
Excellent. Well,
if it may be interesting, but what will you do with it?
Okay, I will echo that then. Tune into the third one. Hey, thanks everyone for joining this session. I see quite some comments already. Thank you, and you found it useful. So please, by the way, if you have any constructive criticism, also put it in the chat box so we can learn and approve and take it in to the next session and maximize the value of that for you. And then also there's the feedback form. If you want to take 2 minutes to give us your comments, that would help us also to serve you better next time. Thanks for joining the conference board. Thank you again, Nancy and Bruce, for this awesome work together. I love it. I look forward to our next one already, and possibly beyond, because I want to have more conversations around this topic, right, as well. This is such a great feeding ground for having a conversation amongst all of us. So maybe if anybody...
Well, John, I'll quickly add, it's not just large companies, too. It's small and mid-sized companies, but that's the next set.
Okay. So, or maybe that's number 4. Thanks again, Bruce. Thanks again, Nancy. Wonderful. Thanks, everyone. I wish you a great rest of day, morning, evening, night, wherever you are. Hope to see you soon again. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.